Well, hello and welcome to our Hearing Health Foundation research webinar. Please enable the Zoom captions by clicking the CC button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Right there at the bottom, that's right. These captions can be moved anywhere on your screen, and if you need any other assistance using Zoom, follow the link to the technical guide shared in the chat. Also, this event is being recorded and will be posted with captions. Now, by way of introduction, my name is Dr. Anil Lawani. I'm a professor and vice chairman for research in the Department of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery, or ENT, as well as the associate dean for student research at the Columbia University Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York. I'm also a board member at the Hearing Health Foundation and the head of Hearing Health Foundation's Council of Scientific Trustees. They oversee the Emerging Research Grant Program, affectionately known as ERG, or Emerging Research Grants. Now, ERG is a competitive program that awards funds to researchers conducting cutting-edge hearing and balance research. These grants supported many leaders in our field become successful scientists, including Dr. Beula Magimairaj, our speaker today. Now let's get to the topic of our webinar today. Well, research from hearing, language, and cognitive studies helps us better assess children who struggle to listen, even though their standard hearing tests are typical. Now, in this research webinar, Dr. Beula Magimairaj will explain how different challenges can occur together, effective testing methods, and impacts on school performance and educational needs. Now, Dr. Magimairaj is a research scientist at Utah State University's Early Childhood Education and Research Center. She's the recipient of the 2015 Emerging Research Grant Scientist. She's an ERG scientist, generously funded by the Royal Arch Research Assistance. Now she's continued investigations in this area, now with an R21 grant from the National Institute of Deafness and Other Communication Disorders. Now we really appreciate Royal Arch Research Assistance for their ongoing support of science that will increase our understanding of the mechanisms, causes, diagnosis, and treatments of central auditory processing disorders. Now, Hearing Health Foundation's ERG program that provides seed money to scientists who are starting out in their field of research is only possible through the generosities of supporters like you. Now, if you'd like to support our work on hearing loss and tinnitus and related conditions, you can do so today at hhf.org/donate. Now we'll move to Dr. Magimairaj's presentation. Now please ask questions through the Q&A box linked at the bottom of the screen again, we'll try to answer those questions after the presentation. Dr. Magimairaj, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Lalwani, for that wonderful introduction. Hello, everyone, for taking the time to attend this webinar. And I am excited to talk to you today about integrating auditory, memory, and language evaluations to understand how children listen. And before I do that, I would like to acknowledge our funding sources. First and foremost, the Hearing Health Foundation's Royal Arch Masons Research Assistance Award that was granted to me in 2015. That was really crucial to launch this area of work. And as a consequence of that, we learned a lot of important things about children with listening difficulties that we are continuing with ongoing support. Right now, we are funded from the NIH, and I know I'm talking today to the generous donors, the Royal Arch Masons at the Hearing Health Foundation. So I want to tell you personally that because of you, we are making a real difference. And that is helping us to, stay focused on our goal to help every child reach their full potential. This would be the webinar's outline. We will talk about, I will briefly first talk to you about what auditory problems, processing problems in children look like. And then we will delve into a few of the diagnostic terms associated with children having listening difficulties. And then I will summarize what the issues really are faced by children and families. And that really is the foundation for the research I do. And we will wrap up with a few examples of how our Hearing Health Foundation funded research has improved the understanding of children with listening difficulties. And then I will end with some takeaway points, as key main ideas that would be the outcome from this webinar. So to begin, let's talk about what auditory problems, auditory processing problems in children look like. So there's a longer list of symptoms. I've just pulled a few here as to highlight these points. So we find that children who have auditory processing difficulties or disorders may have difficulty determining which direction the sound is coming from. They also frequently seem to have difficulty understanding spoken language, particularly when the environment is complex auditorily, for example, listening in a very distractible auditory environment, or they also have challenges when the language demands of what they hear are more, higher. Often you'd find parents and teachers say that the children frequently ask for repetitions, they don't pay attention, they take too long to respond, and you also find that many of the children have associated reading, spelling, or learning problems. And what I'd like to add here is audiologists, as we know, will assess the listening, sensitivity in children, but they also have ways to assess some of the auditory processes directly. So what I have on this slide is a simplified version of, the main processes that the audiologist assesses when children are referred to them for assessment. They look at the children's ability to tell which direction a sound is coming from, or if it is in their right ear, or if they're hearing in their left ear. They also might look at, if children can distinguish between subtle differences, in sound, such as when they hear bat versus pat, can they tell if they heard the same words or were they different words? They also look at the durational aspect of sounds. For example, they may have children hear two beeps with a very small and lessening gap between the two beeps, and they ask the children if they heard two beeps or if they heard one beep. If a child cannot detect the gap, they will report that they heard just one beep. So these durational aspects are relevant for processing slow versus fast speech and so on. The last two, what you see listed on the slide, D and E, are somewhat related. The first one is children's ability to focus on one sound while ignoring the other. So think about we sitting at a restaurant and trying to listen to a friend during a conversation. So the ability to inhibit all that distracting background noise while focusing on the target speech, is considered an important auditory process, listening to speech in noise. And finally, the ability to understand speech when it is unclear, is distorted or has, missing information. So the diagnoses commonly associated with children who have auditory processing disorder are listed here. So an audiologist, when they look at all those processes that you just saw on the previous slide, if there are problems in say two or more of those areas, they may diagnose a child with auditory processing disorder, and they have specific cutoff criteria and scoring procedures in order to do that. But what is seen very often is that the children also have other coexisting diagnoses. And most commonly seen among them are developmental language disorder. Is also previously was known as SLI, specific language impairment, or they may have the umbrella diagnosis of learning disability, or many may be diagnosed by a psychologist with attention deficit disorder. Now, frequently, what diagnostic labels the child receives is also dependent on the referral source. who they went, which professional they went to first. So for example, if the speech language pathologist determined it to be developmental language disorder and the problems the child is facing was well explained by that label, they may or may not, refer the children for some of the other evaluations. The other evaluations may get missed out. Okay. And at this juncture, I'd like to also add an important point. The population that I'm referring to here during this presentation, in all regards, is referring to children who have listening difficulties during the developmental period. Okay, we are not talking about children who may have, say, a neurological disease or a disorder, such as maybe there's a tumor in the central auditory pathway that is leading to auditory processing problems. We are not including those populations in this talk today. We are purely talking about only developmental listening problems, not acquired kind of conditions such as traumatic brain injury or an adult, say, having processing disorders, auditory processing disorders after a TBI. So in each discipline, we conduct, a thorough assessment. We do our due diligence. And one of the things I'd like to point about clinical practice patterns is that even though we as individual professionals, as speech language pathologists, audiologists, psychologists, most commonly in this situation, this population we're talking about, we may not have a unified profile of the child unless we integrate the assessments we do individually. So, and the second point is about the gaps that we know exist in children with listening difficulty. There's been gaps in the research literature as well. For example, we do not have the best estimates of prevalence of auditory processing disorder. And some of the reasons for this is that there has been variability in the choice of assessments audiologists typically use because there is no one standard protocol. There has been some variability in the tests that audiologists choose to, look at how the children are doing in auditory processing. A second reason why we don't have good estimates of the prevalence is because of APD's co-occurrence with a lot of other conditions like the ones I just listed, developmental language disorder most commonly. And finally, unlike conditions like autism or language disorder, where we have significant amount of data on how the disorder manifests and progresses, we don't seem to know enough still. We need to know a lot more about the course of development of APD. So some of these things can cause challenges to families and educators. For example, the use of multiple labels and not having a unified profile of, what is the nature of the listening problem in the children. And that only can help us, serve the children best. So why is this research needed? Why do we do what we do? The first is the differences in the way professionals characterize listening difficulties in children. Different professionals are looking at the child from their lens, but what is seemed to be lacking is more integration of how these processes between audition and language, say, for example, are working together. Auditory processing disorder by itself is not a qualifying diagnosis for special education services in public schools. And generally, the expectation is that the child's problems fit under a speech and language disorder category or maybe under learning disabilities. And sometimes, in rare situations, it may be classified under other health impairment. But that all these are challenges that clinicians or families may face as they seek to obtain services. And finally, given the diversity of symptoms, auditory processing disorder may not fit neatly under the existing categories of disability. So one more aspect, again, foundational to what we do, is we know this is not new information that children with listening difficulties must receive a multidisciplinary evaluation across the various areas we've talked about. But unfortunately, not every child is able to receive that because, say, for example, not all school districts have educational audiologists on hand. So some of these assessments may be done in a different setting outside of the school system, and that can pose some challenges in, that can pose as a barrier to integrating the different evaluations that are done for a child. So what is the outcome on families and children in particular? Children, particularly if they have co-occurring deficits across multiple areas, and especially if they have non-qualifying scores, they're not really significantly poorly scoring across all the areas, but they seem to have this scattered pattern of low scores, but they're not really severely affected. It is those children who tend to slip through the cracks, and that inadequate support consequently, causes them to continue to struggle with language processing demands, which, increase with every grade. And so then the problem sort of increases with time. So we really need a better understanding of the nature of the listening difficulties to best help the children. And that's where our framework and our research, kicks in. What we proposed is a model where we see listening difficulties as an umbrella term, which could be caused due to various sources of problem in children. It could be deficits in the auditory processing pathway. It could also stem from cognitive, deficits in aspects such as attention or memory, and be based on language-related weaknesses. Now, we have a lot of decades of work in all these areas, and again, I want to acknowledge here that our research builds on work that has already been done by various researchers and various wonderful research groups. I'm not going to be able to cite all the work that others have done, given the scope and limited time in this particular talk. But most importantly, our work focuses on the relationships between these sub areas as it relates to listening. So rather than focusing singularly on auditory processing measures and the outcome, that is the listening problem, or diagnosing the auditory processing disorder, what we are most interested in explaining better is how are these areas interacting within the population? Because in the brain, we don't have compartments for the various disciplines. So our research contributes to this expanded framework because, as we all know, successful listening, especially in a challenging auditory environment, is complex. We have to reconstruct speech. If we have missed information, we fill in the missed information when speech is unclear. And we also have seen that, and this is from cumulative research studies, when we look at populations, say, of just children with developmental language disorder, and then when you look at another group where you have children with developmental language disorder plus auditory processing disorder diagnosed, those two groups are remarkably similar. So that has been taken to suggest that these are not separate disorders necessarily, but are often co-occurring problems, right? And there have been strong links between listening difficulties and language abilities that have been established. And we've done some of that through our own work that I will be presenting here soon. And the relationship between attention and memory and listening problems seems to depend on the nature of the listening task. So I'm just going to present a couple of our studies to highlight how we've done this and what we've done. In one of the first studies, again, this is funded by the Hearing Health Foundation funding. We had two groups of kids, one group with children who had listening difficulties based on a parent questionnaire, and we had age-matched children who did not report whose parents did not report of such difficulties. In addition to the core listening auditory symptoms only, the children also were reported to have a range of other symptoms that it was in agreement to what we already know about these children having co-occurring problems. So as you can see, the children had difficulty recalling information, remembering information for later recall, easy distractibility, below grade academic performance, and some also had other labels such as ADHD and language disorder. So what we did was we administered tasks in all the three areas. We administered auditory processing tests, speech perception and noise, listening to sentences in noise. The children repeat the sentences back. They listen to, in binaural integration, they combine information coming to both ears. They hear numbers, two numbers in each of the ears simultaneously, and they have to report back all the four numbers after they hear them. In the temporal processing, it's the gap detection that I spoke to you about earlier. In the language area, we looked at both receptive language ability and expressive language ability. All these are standard measures. We looked at word level vocabulary, as well as sentence level, assessments within language. And finally, in the cognitive domain, we looked at short-term memory ability, working memory, and attention. So short-term memory is one's ability to hear something in the short term and repeat back. For example, we hear a series of numbers, repeat back the numbers we heard in the same order we heard them, with the list length increasing gradually. And the maximum length, there's a limit to which we can, hold all the numbers accurately. And how well we do on that task is a measure of our short-term memory. What I'd like to highlight here is that we took a few design considerations as we, designed some of these tasks for our work. Instead of having the children listen to and repeat numbers, we visually presented the digits to them on the screen and let them recall the numbers on a grid on the screen. And we did the same thing with the working memory measure. There, children again have to store numbers while they have to do a simple processing task in between each of the numbers they see. And I'm going to play you a short clip, just a 30-second clip to show you what I'm talking about that can kind of give you a good idea of this working memory modified task example.
Verbal working memory.
So as you saw, modifying some of the tasks is relevant when we're testing this population. So in this case, we accounted for any of the listening issues to be affecting memory performance in this particular example. So those were some of the elements we paid attention to while designing tasks to look at all the areas in the children. So what did we find? We found that the groups differed in listening and noise ability, their short-term memory capacity, and several language measures. They did not, they did not have problems with, memory or working memory or attention, and they did, they did not differ in dichotic digits performance or gap detection, which are other auditory processing measures. So similar to what we already know about the children did not perform poorly on all of the auditory processing measures. And we also found that children now who have speech and noise performance that is poor also seem to have a weak language system. So strong links between reported listening difficulty and language abilities is one of the key findings of this paper. And in addition to the language deficits, we know from cumulative literature that speech perception and noise difficulty and children's ability to hear in a spatial environment where they have to locate and track sounds, say the target and the distractor are in the same position, it's harder to detect the target if the target sound and the noise that is affecting the listening are spatially separated, makes it easier for the children to listen. So when children are faced with that kind of spatial listening demands, that's one place where there seem to be a lot more challenges. And within the language areas, even when global language scores are found to be within the normal range, we found that word access and retrieval, so our word knowledge, retrieving a word from that seems to be one key area within language that seems to be hard for the children. And again, from other studies of ours in both adults and children, we have found that accessing a word and recalling it from our long-term memory storage, this is stored knowledge which we have, accumulated over time. Being able to recall words is an ability that predicts listening in noise. So you see here is an example of how we have made the links or have demonstrated links between how our language and memory system is linked to our listening ability in noise. So rather than seeing them as distinct areas of assessments which we distinctly assess, which are distinctly evaluated by different professionals, we want to see how they are intersecting. Cognitive factors such as attention or working memory in many of our studies and even others have shown weak associations with the listening auditory processing test scores. So again, we come back to the point that language ability seems to be a bigger underlying source of the problem in many of these children. And the role of attention and memory, it is not that it is not important, it seems to depend on the demands of the listening task. A second study here, in this study, we had a sample of 216 children who were diagnosed with developmental language disorder, and they were part of a larger project. The children had received multiple auditory processing and language measures as part of that big project. Now, what we were interested in looking at were relationships between their performance on auditory processing tests and a language measure, which was a good measure that was reflective of, day-to-day performance. So in this case, we chose story comprehension as that outcome language measure, because the story comprehension measure reflects multiple language level units. It captures integration of short-term memory and retrieval from long-term memory. It also captures a higher level language capacity. You're making inferences, reasoning about things in the story, and it's an ecologically valid measure because it's reflecting children's day-to-day listening performance, spoken language performance at school. So what we found was, among the auditory processing tests, the group of tests which involved tone perception, like discriminating the pitch of tones or detecting a tone which was being masked by another, masker noise, those kind of tasks did not explain significant variance in children's story comprehension ability. On the other hand, children's speech perception and noise ability uniquely explained a significant amount of variance in children's story comprehension ability. So that really made a difference. Children's ability to listen in noise seemed to be important to their ability to perform on the stories. And this was even after we controlled for other relevant factors, such as maturation, vocabulary, and the tone perception skills. So we cannot ignore the day-to-day implications of adverse listening situations for children with developmental language disorder. So here we have expanded the population of interest here. We're just not talking about children with APD, but when we want to think about these populations from a global view and think about what difficulty listening can look like for a child who is already having a diagnosis of developmental language disorder. So really, these concepts have applications to a much larger population than we would think of just based on our basic assessments. So here are my takeaways from what I've presented so far. The first one, we want to focus on modeling the role of cognitive linguistic mechanisms during listening. That is crucial, rather than just focus on each of, the individual areas in assessment. For example, just focusing on the isolated evaluation of the central auditory pathway. Those are most definitely important, but we want to also look at is how those are linked together. So for example, the association we've shown between listening in noise ability and children's ability to comprehend spoken stories has implications, not just for children who have listening difficulties with clinically normal audiograms, they have normal listening levels, but also for children who, say, have a hearing loss. So these concepts have much larger, have implications for, larger groups as well. Second, design of experimental tasks or materials we use for assessment in children with listening difficulties is important to consider to make sure our assessments are valid. I gave you the example of visual presentation in one case. Another example is of a commonly used measure that audiologists use in clinical assessment, speech and noise measurements, where they have children listen to, say, a sentence in noise, and the children are asked to repeat the sentence. Now, in speech-language pathology, we know that sentence repetition is a strong clinical marker of a language disorder because just sentence repetition taps into our ability to, our grammatical competence to reconstruct that sentence back. So a measure like that can actually reflect language weaknesses as well as listening in noise weaknesses. So we did a study where we looked at one of the commercially available speech and noise measures just to make sure how children's language and cognitive abilities affect performance in their listening in noise on that measure. And we found that measure did not get influenced by the children's language and cognitive abilities, which sort of uh, obtained data to suggest that that was a good measure to use, in clinical practice. Takeaway 3, any assessments, interventions we use should be based on research evidence. So some of our work has generated, for example, one aspect such as the word knowledge and processing from, word knowledge and recalling words from long-term memory to be highly predictive of listening in complex situations, auditory situations. So based on research evidence, we can suggest that to be a very important area to be looking at in these kids. And so I want to emphasize on this a little more by saying vocabulary knowledge, receptive language is one thing. Where does the child know a word? So I have 4 pictures. I name one of them and the child points to one of the pictures. So receptive vocabulary tends to be strong in many of these children. It is in expressive areas such as those listed on the slide, which capture, associations between words, children's ability to recall words accurately with speed. Those are the ones that seem to be sensitive in picking the weaknesses that we see in many of the children who do have these listening concerns. So, naming items in a short duration of time, defining words, what words do you associate it, say, with the word desk. Some of these are examples of, assessments we can use. Also, why this particular area of lexical or word processing is important to look at is because the quality of our, lexical knowledge, word knowledge, and all those factors are important for successful listening. And particularly in children when they don't have a robust grammatical knowledge yet, if grammar is still developing, they will tend to rely on the areas of vocabulary when they don't have a strong grammatical knowledge developed as yet, when it's still maturing. So that's why this area is of particular importance to children who have some of these difficulties. Takeaway number 4, in children with listening difficulties, we see heterogeneous performance patterns all the time, which is why we want to make sure we examine performance across all the areas. The child needs to have those referrals done, not missed out. And importantly, we want to collaborate with other professionals to unify those evaluations and get a complete profile of the child. And that can help us support qualification for services based on this comprehensive profile we build and the limitations the child is facing in school or elsewhere. And it's not restricted by a singular diagnosis. And the final takeaway is related to intervention. Again, I want to make sure I emphasize that this is not at all a comprehensive note about recommendations. This is just key points related to our research studies. We already know there are assistive listening devices, listening training programs, compensatory strategies. There's plenty of those information, that supports children with listening difficulties. And also we have plenty of data that exists on the importance of music exposure, even as a preventive factor beginning in early infancy to, prevent such difficulties. So from our research work, what we have found that focusing on boosting language mechanisms, because they're often part of the problem and they can help compensate for the listening difficulty, is really important. And when it comes to, availability of auditory training programs or cognitive factors, instead of training them in isolation, on computerized programs, what is most important is, because these are important ingredients in intervention and therapy, it is best if these are embedded within a language intervention framework, within a listening to spoken language framework, rather than listening to, non-speech type materials. Finally, focusing on access and recall of words. What we focused on in what we learned from our studies, we want to use those kind of things, those ingredients in intervention in meaningful language context. So for example, stories provide a meaningful language context where there is a context which children can hold on to as they are trying to, answer questions or, know the main idea of what they heard, organize that information, and so on. Our ongoing research is funded by NIDCD, as we mentioned, and currently we're looking at the association of speech perception and noise and sentence comprehension in children. And we're also looking at how vocabulary and memory factors are, influencing these relationships. And to wrap up, here is the team I have worked with. Natalie Benefield was at my previous institution when I had the grant funded from Hearing Health Foundation. And currently at Utah State University, I have collaborated with Dr. Ronald Gillum and Dr. Vanjik. And Naveen is my collaborator from the beginning, and we continue to collaborate on this work. And thank you very much for listening. I appreciate your attending this webinar.
Well, Beula, that was really amazing. Especially the association of auditory, processing with language and their really strong interconnectedness. I didn't appreciate that in the past. In fact, there's an interesting question from one of the audience members that says, as an anonymous attendee, do you think that the link between language cognition and auditory processing would disappear or weaken if the auditory processing tests evaluated lower level auditory processing devoid of language or cognition load? That is, if you made that particular part simpler, would that become less intertwined?
Sure. So I think the focus of our work, and that may be the case, like you mentioned, because that's what we found in the study where we had the 216 children with DLD, developmental language disorder. The tone perception tasks did not predict their real world performance. So really what seems to matter from the clinical perspective and what parents or teachers really want is the child doing poorly in this aspect. They're not, responding when we listen, we ask for repetition. So when we look at the real world performance where where it's really causing trouble to them, ecologically valid outcomes, when we look at that, what is most contributing to that functional problem? So when we are looking at that, seems to be the speech and noise and the language factors are taking predominance. Most definitely the foundational aspect that you mentioned with sound are basic to listening, no doubt about that. They are foundational to listening, but don't seem to be, they don't seem to be the most important when we look at the relative importance of these.
And when you think about hearing and language, you're really thinking about very different brain areas too. It's not that there's an overlap that's leading to a similar problem in languages, but you think they're actually interconnected, but really different parts of the brain is.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, there's the continuity. So we have the hearing mechanism. So in a way, we look at it from a pathway that is continuous. That's the way we think about it, the peripheral hearing pathway, and then we have the central pathway, and then we have the language areas. But then there's a lot of top-down processing that happens too, and also a lot of interconnectedness between the areas, even the core auditory processing areas in the brain and the language areas, in the brain. So even though we've traditionally thought of it as that continuum of, listening, cumulative evidence suggests there's a lot of, top-down work also going on in the brain, as well as, interconnected pathways. For example, the attentional networks, they are starting to work much earlier than even before the hearing, the signal reaches those hearing areas and language areas.
Do children with this auditory processing and language also have reading difficulty? Because one of the attendees suggested maybe that allows access to services in school districts that otherwise may not be accessible.
That's absolutely right. Many of the children, based on our studies, based on studies from others, many of the children seem to have, not always all of them, but many children do seem to have reading and math as the two top areas where they seem to show below grade level performance. And in some instances, the association between, phonemic processing as it relates to the reading problems, that association has been established. But then there are other models where we've shown that, a larger language-based problem can underlie those reading comprehension problems as well.
You
That's
spoke
absolutely right.
You spoke about, actually, before I get there, you talked about certain different evaluations, auditory processing and language. Are there imaging evaluation necessary, or is this the imaging is normally normal, or is there any role for that?
Right. So for clinically, that doesn't kind of form part of the protocol for evaluating these children because there is no, like I said, no identified causal factor or lesion that can be viewed on a scan. But yes, there is emerging imaging studies that are looking at these comorbid groups of children and trying to see, okay, what is different in these children's brain. There are more recent studies that yes are focusing on that, but from the clinical perspective, imaging is not part of a diagnostic evaluation in the developmental scenario that we just talked about.
So there's been previous work, one of the questions that's coming up is related to middle ear pathology, conductive hearing loss from recurrent infections and
Mhm.
language issues like dyslexia or auditory processing. Any interconnectedness between middle ear pathology and central auditory processing disorders, language acquisition issues?
So in children, again, that seems to be definitely a risk factor because we know that when children have those recurrent episodes of middle ear, hearing problems, they have these intermittent phases of when they're not listening. And particularly what gets affected is binaural integration. So when we listen, sound goes to both the ears and our, pathways are able to integrate what is heard between both the ears and able to separate them. So it is that binaural processing is one of the things that is problematic for when children have those conductive problems. And over time, it can have cumulative effects. And that definitely is, in some children, is a risk factor for those problems, especially the spatial listening component that I talked about, when you have to separate a target from a distractor noise, and it gets harder when they're both close together in space.
You spoke about the impact of noise, and
Mhm.
certainly either sound field amplification, FM auditory trainers,
Mhm.
or even hearing aids can potentially overcome the impact of background noise. What are your thoughts about any of those things? What is the literature telling us what to do?
Absolutely. So we definitely have robust literature related to the assistive listening devices, such as FM devices, and now with the Bluetooth, where the speaker directly transmits to the listener, and in a school environment, it can be done in a sound field, way as well. That definitely helps. Again, not just children who have a diagnosis of auditory processing disorder. It has also been now in some studies used for children who just have a developmental language disorder as a diagnosis. So providing them good acoustics definitely makes them perform better too. So some of those are most definitely very useful, simple, proven methods that have existed for a long time and being used. Research with hearing aids, there is much to be seen on that yet. So I will not comment on that yet. Yeah.
Got it. Um, there's a question from Leslie Mason that says, if the child has language disorder, ADHD, and/or a diagnosis of dyslexia, can they have the label of auditory processing disorder since these are higher order overarching disorders? Very specific question, but I think
Yeah.
you can really kind of expound on that very broadly and maybe give us we'll
Right.
talk about those language disorders a little bit because not everybody I think has
Mhm.
equal knowledge in the
Right.
audience.
Right. And that's a great question from Leslie because that is the current, cumulative thinking is, when we have these overarching disorders, are we able to, best assess the auditory processing? There's some controversy on this as well. You have both sides of the coin. So I think from our perspective, from the modeling, what matters is we don't want to also say that, okay, because the child has a language disorder, I'm going to ignore the auditory central pathway altogether. We want to, see what we've learned over the decades of research and, clinical work within the auditory processing domain. Okay, what is it that overlaps too much with those higher order processes? For example, dichotic digits, heavily attention based, so it's going to, be affected by attention. So we have some improvised ways of looking at it where people look at different scores where some of those things can be accounted for, where you're still getting a good measure of binaural processing while controlling for the higher order influence. So some of not our research studies, but by others, have found ways to use different scores to account for those interfering factors. And like I said, we don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater. So uh, not necessarily the diagnostic label, but there are some key areas within auditory processing that may be important not to miss out being evaluated just because we got the global term. So, and that's why our framework includes all those three areas, because to the best we can, if we have the information, then we can build a best profile of the child.
An anonymous attendee asked the question, what's your opinion on the gold standard issue in the area of CAPD diagnosis?
So, like I said, there are a few things. Again, it's not just me saying it, cumulative research has established it. Whether, this condition exists or not, that is not, the question. The question is, in the developmental scenario, how do we best examine these aspects in these children? Because we have other things going on. Like I said, unlike a condition where there's a known neurological disease or tumor sitting somewhere in the auditory pathway, where we know it's a focal lesion and we know what findings to expect. In developmental disorders, development itself is the key to understanding developmental disorders. So the challenge is all these areas are working together and evolving with time. And one of the areas can affect assessments in the other areas. So we want to make sure our, say, an auditory processing test we use has, stood the test of time in terms of having standard scores. And we have specific criteria that are not too variable. So those are some things it's in front of us to deal with. So I will not challenge that as an entity, but what I would say is we need to unify these areas better and have a good selection of tools and assess what would really contribute to that functional listening performance. If it's not contributing to tell us about the child's day-to-day challenges, that test probably is going to be not useful in this developmental scenario.
I should have asked this question, but this is a great question. You commented something earlier, and Jess Rady's ask, why is research on adopting low gain hearing aids for the CAPD population so scant? Unlike some of these measures, assessing hearing aid benefits seems likely would be relatively straightforward RCT design with measurable outcomes. So why are there so few studies with?
So I do have audiological training as part of my undergrad and master's, but here I'm a certified speech language pathologist, but I will take that question. I think the bottom line is when there is no hearing loss, no problem with hearing sensitivity, the justification for providing amplification is always, there should be justification to provide that amplification. And in children, doing so, will have to undergo more scrutiny as to you don't want to use amplification when it is not needed. So I think that's one of the things. Research, there is not much out there, but it would be good to, if it is really something that would work, it would be good to have some research, evidence-based research findings to support that, through some solid studies. But again, right now we don't have enough to do that widely. And with noise reduction, and there are more technologies, again, I'm not going to speak as an audiologist would, but we have much more sophisticated technologies today that would probably help the children, through those without, causing any harm. But again, more research is needed, so that's not something I'm recommending on this platform.
So talking about sophisticated question, we have one from Donna Geffner, which is based really on research methodology. Listening difficulties were based on a parent questionnaire. How was that validated?
So yes, in our study, we drew those questions from the existing APD questionnaires that are already clinically used. So most of them are from, well-known clinical APD questionnaires. We do have a more validated questionnaire now. It's called the Evaluation of Children's Language and Processing Skills, which has undergone, again, it's not published by us, but it's by Dave Moore and his team. That definitely covers all the areas within cognition, language, and audition, and is a much more better validated questionnaire now to use. So yes, in our study, we did not recruit children who were diagnosed as having APD. We recruited children whose parents reported that they had listening difficulties. So again, it's because that is the problem we face in the field. We have these children who are slipping through the cracks. They're reporting to have problems, but then they don't have specific diagnosis. They don't have the right referral route. So we just wanted to see those children who are reported to have the problems, and then we want to look at their global profile. Yeah.
Um, this is sort of a nomenclature question. Given the comorbidity of auditory processing and language, do we need new terminology or new way to think about this so we don't miss one or the others? You know, somebody has a language issue, we should always do auditory processing testing or vice versa? Or is this just so obvious that that's not necessary?
So I think some of the terms, at least some researchers have begun to use now, is the LID, listening difficulties term, so that it can, encompass all of these children. So we are not, because pure auditory processing disorder, particularly in the developmental scenario, is very hard to find. Almost always, it's again like a rule, not an exception. Children have these multiple conditions. So, like I said, it is a symptom. Like if I say, if I have a working memory, if I have poor working memory scores, do I need to have a label of working memory disorder? Probably not, because it is, part of a larger profile. So we most definitely should address and evaluate auditory processing deficits, but do we need to have an extra label? I would think it should be, it can be well served under an umbrella such as developmental language disorder, that can, encompass the multiple problems the child is facing.
Another anonymous attendee question: what is the minimum age LID can be identified? And maybe if you can also follow up with the natural history this in children. Will they outgrow it, or or without treatment, with treatment, and so on? If you could speak to that broadly.
Yeah. So here again, there are some differences of opinion in the clinical field. Some members may, evaluate children younger than, 7 years of age. But typically, what we've seen is some of these measures, and at least the ones I've seen in the lab, um, 7 and older can best understand these instructions and, follow the protocol. And so where you think what you're measuring is a valid measure of their performance. So younger children may not always understand the instructions that is expected on tasks such as, dichotic digits or other tasks. Secondly, in terms of the progression, again, we don't have studies where, unlike we seen in autism and developmental language disorder, we don't have conducted studies with sufficient populations which show us the trajectory of how the disorder, progresses with time. So at a younger age, if there are any symptoms that children have with respect to, the listening profile or the language profile, most definitely we should get them screened and, follow the language stimulation. Like I said, music exposure, all of those wonderful stimulation and enrichment procedures, which benefit all children, should be emphasized much early on so that we can prevent some of these. And more research again needs to be done with younger children to see exactly what happens. Say there are, groups of children who are at high risk, say premature children. So we have populations like that in whom we can then see what's going on with the system. If it's a developmental maturation issue, what's going on. But we, unlike some of the other populations, we don't have those kind of established studies with sufficient numbers specific to just the APD population.
This is a great question because it directly impacts what I do. Do ear specialists, or otologists, neurotologists, otolaryngologists have a role either in the clinical management of these children or on research questions? When they come to us, what should we be doing, and how should we be engaging, whether it's clinically or in the research arena?
Wow, that So I think I have seen frequently, when I saw data from, in Arkansas Children's Hospital and even other research studies have reported, children who do have these problems at a younger age tend to come back to the hospital for those evaluations when they reach, say, college age, because they're still having those challenges which have not been intervened successfully or adequately. So they most definitely would be, I think, coming to specialists who will then send them to audiologists. Uh, but I think in terms of the role of specialists like yourself, um, there's nothing in terms of medical management that I am aware of, unless it's, a pathology that we're talking about. Again, in the developmental context, it is the other paraprofessionals who have the important role to play. I think referral would be the most key thing to do to make sure they're referred to educational and language and psychological evaluations as well as needed.
And I think this may be our last question.
Mhm.
What are the implications of your work for adults? Is there some
Mhm.
lessons to learn here in terms of how we think about adult APD? Are they same?
Mhm.
Are they
Mhm.
different? Anything you'd like to add about that?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So, most of our work is in children, but one of the things that we have found in a study with adults as well is that lexical knowledge and retrieval factor, being able to access my mental lexicon and being able to pull that word out. If I'm good at that, I'm going to be better at hearing in a noisy situation. So for adults, that definitely matters. So anything that can, be done to boost that system will most definitely help adults. And some of the things like the assistive listening devices and compensatory strategies most definitely extend to the adult world as well. Um, yeah.
Well, this was definitely wonderful, wonderful presentation, and you definitely answered all these questions that were, I think, very complicated and complex, and our audience was fully engaged. So you have a lot of fans out there, a lot of fans who are engaged in your work. Um, I thank you all for your attendance, and Dr. Magimairaj, of course, for this informative, very informative presentation. We're so grateful to you, our community, and of course, Royal Arch Research Assistance for all your support of our Emerging Research Grants Program. Now, remember that you can donate to our efforts and directly participate in our efforts to advance better treatments and cures for hearing and balance conditions by donating at hhf.org. That's hearinghealthfoundation.org/donate. And thank you, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.